Hi everyone, it's Nate here from Pedagogy Not Grata. In this video, I'm going to talk about how better to use evidence for ESSA and WWC clearinghouse. Before we begin, I want to talk about how to interpret research in general. There's three main things that I think you should consider. And this graphic here comes from an article I wrote with Dr. Rachel Shifter. The first thing is impact. So that is the results of the studies. How much did the tested idea improve learning in the classroom? The next is quantity. How many studies have been conducted? In order for an idea to be meaningfully proven, it needs to be replicated and well replicated. I interviewed Dr. Graham on this, Dr. Stephen Graham, sorry, had a little bit of a brain pause moment there. And he said that he didn't feel an idea was proven until it had been replicated 6 times, which is quite a lot to expect. And the last one is quality. That is the rigor of the studies we're looking at. Not all studies are created equally. Some studies have more or less rigorous designs. And it's important not to conflate really rigorous designs with not rigorous designs. So as we go through this, something I really want people to understand is effect sizes and how to interpret them. Effect sizes are standardized percentages, essentially. They show you what is the mean difference that a treatment made corrected for variability. Now, there's two main types of effect size calculations that we see. One is where we compare pre to post difference. That's we measure the total learning within a year, typically. Or in a better case scenario, we compare the post-test difference between the treatment group and the control group. This type of effect size is much more meaningful because it's measuring what we call the magnitude of effect. We expect students to learn across a period of time in a year. But a treatment doesn't always improve learning. And if we compare a treatment group to a control group, we measure how much better the treatment group did. This is finding the true meaningful impact of a program or a pedagogy. So evidence for ESSA, myself, and WWC Clearinghouse all use the second type of effect size typically when we're examining programs. So the following chart helps you to interpret the effect sizes. This is the standard guideline for interpretation. So between 0.2 to 0.50, or sorry, 0.2 to 0.40 is considered small. 0.40 to 0.8 is considered moderate, and above 0.8 is considered strong. Now, generally speaking, this is a very rough guideline. The problem is that very few studies that are rigorous fall into the strong category. In fact, I would say that if a study has an effect size of above 0.40 and is rigorous, that is extremely strong proof that the program or pedagogy is effective, generally speaking. Now, within the standard interpretation guideline, we are supposed to say that studies with effect sizes below 0.20 are negligible, meaning the results are too small to be attributed to a meaningful causality. That said, there are some exceptions to this. In non-rigorous studies, we expect higher effect sizes, especially if they use the first type of effect size calculation I discussed, where we look at pre to post differences. And in studies that have a really similar treatment group and control group, we expect to see very low effect sizes. And I'll give a specific example. I once looked at a study where they compared graphic organizers on a piece of paper to graphic organizers on a computer to see which one had a bigger impact on reading comprehension outcomes. Obviously, in that study, we would expect a very small difference because the treatment and the control group are almost doing the identical thing. We don't expect having a graphic organizer in a computer versus on a piece of paper to make a meaningful difference. So let's start talking about evidence for ESSA and WWC clearance. I do want to start by saying that I have been very critical of them in the past for a couple of reasons, but I do think they have value. I want to talk about their value and why I think it's important to understand how best to use their guides or their research. My big criticism is that they're overly focused on rigor or quality. To go back to our previous graphic, they don't tend to place a strong emphasis on the impact or the results of studies or the quantity of studies. The assumption seems to be that if the research is rigorous, we don't need replication and we don't need to be as concerned about the impact. I think this is problematic. For one thing, as Dr. Dylan Williams pointed out to me, studies that are have positive results are 15 times more likely to be peer-reviewed. Well, this means that we have to assume almost all studies are going to show a positive result. So just seeing a positive result in itself is not enough, regardless of the rigor of the study, because we expect studies to show a positive result. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. Part of it is journals don't want to publish results that aren't interesting, and they tend to find negative and null findings as uninteresting. Journals, or sorry, researchers often have a particular bias, not all, but often, and they want to prove their hypothesis, especially if they're working for a pedagogical company like a language program company. They want to prove their program works. So they're not going to want to submit any research that doesn't show a positive finding. And then there are some companies that do negative or unscrupulous practices, such as p-hacking, which involves using multiple measurements, looking for one that finds a statistical significant finding, and then only publishing the statistically significant finding. Similarly, we can do the same thing with small-scale studies. We can replicate multiple small-scale studies at once, and then publish the one where we have the best findings. So, for example, you could do a study in 10 different classrooms at the same time, and then you could only publish the ones that show the highest results. Whereas in reality, you should have probably published all 10 findings at the same time as one study. The other criticism I'll make of evidence for ESSA and What Works Clearinghouse is that a lot of what they have to say isn't really in teacher-friendly language, so it's hard to, I think, for the average person to understand them. Although, admittedly, other people have made some criticism of me, although I try very hard to try and make what we do at Pedagogy Not Grata as teacher-friendly as possible, because our main goal is to serve teachers. That said, there's one thing that I think evidence for ESSA and What Works Clearinghouse do extremely well. Actually, I think evidence for ESSA and What Works Clearinghouse do a really good job of analyzing study rigor. It's a really good source for looking at how high quality a study was. And What Works Clearinghouse does a really good job, I think, in terms of categorizing a large number of studies. So they tend to exclude most studies based on the rigor not being meeting their expectations, because they have extremely high expectations for rigor, which then I think creates a problem of replication when you read the results, because the results aren't typically replicated well. They don't meet that 6 guideline that Dr. Graham suggested. However, they do look through a very large number of studies, because they look through all the studies on a program as submitted by a company, and they will provide an in-depth summary of all of those studies that are essentially experimental or quasi-experimental in their reports. And you can read through those reports and get a much more detailed understanding. Now, I'm going to put up an example. This is the top bar of Evidence for ESSA's website for targeted reading instruction, which is a speech-to-print phonics program that was the basis for Reading Simplified. And you'll see a number of things on the screen. And actually, this gives you a lot of information really fast. And that's why I wanted to highlight it and talk about it. So the rating, they will say it's the rating of impact. But essentially what it actually boils down to is the rating of the rigor of the studies, because they place a really strong emphasis on study quality. This ESSA rating really just tells you how rigorous the studies were. So this tells you that the studies they chose to look at were extremely rigorous. They examined 2 studies, there are actually far more than 2 targeted reading instruction studies. And these 2 studies in total had 471 participants. And then they tell you the average effect size. This is actually an unweighted effect size, which is, I think, fine. And it's very large for a reading study. It's 0.51. So what this is really telling you is that there is replicated studies showing a large effect size, and that those studies are extremely rigorous for this program. This is, by the way, ironically, I believe for my review of Reading Simplified, I looked at 9 studies, and we found almost the identical effect size. So I thought it was sort of funny in the sense that we looked at more studies, but we came to the same conclusion. And we also rated their study quality as very high. The next one I want to look at is slightly more controversial. It's Fontes Canal's level literacy instruction. They give a rating of strong. Now, this rating of strong, again, essentially means that the research was really high quality. Now, I think there's some dispute on that. I know some very accomplished scholars who criticize that, but generally speaking, I actually agree that the studies are high quality and rigorous. And they have 566 students in these two studies that they've rated, and they've rated 2 studies in total. Again, there are more than 2 studies on level literacy instruction. However, evidence for ESSA's model is they pick the highest quality studies. They don't look at every study. And lastly, we see the effect size. Now, if you look, the effect size is actually below that 0.20 mark, meaning according to Cohen's guidelines, the results are negligible. This would suggest that evidence for ESSA's review suggests non-meaningful results or benefits of literacy, and that they've looked at high quality research to make that assertion. So that makes me think that you can be reasonably certain that according to evidence for ESSA's review, that LOI is not effective. Now, this is where we get to interpretation differences. There are people out there who would say the rating is strong, therefore the proof is strong. This is ignoring the principle of impact when looking at research. Now, ironically, I think I'm more critical of LOI than evidence for ESSA. However, the effect size I found for evidence or for LOI originally was higher based on the same studies. And the reason that is that evidence for ESSA actually excludes proximal results from their analysis, whereas I don't. I separate it out and tell you what is the proximal, meaning researcher designed assessments or low quality assessment results, and what is the standardized assessment results. I also want to show now, this is what works clearinghouse. So this is a report. I'm reading Read 180, sorry, and they tell you how many studies they reviewed here, and they tell you the studies that they felt met their strongest tier of quality, and that was 9. So you'll see here, this is their overall ratings. They say no meaningful evidence for decoding, strong evidence for impact for comprehension, a strong evidence for impact for literacy achievement, and a moderate evidence for impact for reading fluency. Now, again, these tiers, well, what clearinghouse will say they're related to impact are actually far more to do with research quality and rigor. So this tells you that there are essentially 9 high-quality studies in Read 180, according to Orbs Clearinghouse, 39 studies total. Those will be slightly out of date, and that these studies were, in fact, quite rigorous for their measurements of comprehension and literacy achievement. Now, if you go to my next slide, I'm going to show you what happens if you click this button here. So this gives you a more detailed report if you click Download Intervention Report. And if you scroll down to the very bottom report, past the citations, you'll see these tables. And these tables will show you the effect size for each individual study, for each individual outcome. And they'll tell you how many students were in each group for that outcome. And they'll show you the grade. And you can see here the effect sizes are actually quite low, except for this one, which is the New York State end of the year test, and that's from the specific paper, White et al. 2005. Now, at the bottom of each table, and sometimes the tables actually go across multiple pages, you'll see an average effect size for this domain. So I believe this is their, yes, this is their reading outcomes. So they show an average effect size of 0.15. So if you remember, if we go back, oh, it's for comprehension, I apologize. If you go back, their rating is comprehension, strong. But if you actually look, the effect size on average for comprehension is negligible according to Cohen's guide. So to me, that would suggest with strong confidence that what works clearinghouse research suggests that this program is ineffective for improving comprehension. Now, there's people who disagree with me, and I don't want to try and claim to be the sole source of information here. But if we use Cohen's interpretation guidelines for going through these results, you will find that the results are. You're going to have to excuse my sneeze because I'm terrible at editing. You'll find that these results suggest a null finding. And if you go through these charts, they typically include 4 findings, or tables. They'll include decoding, comprehension, literacy achievement, and reading fluency. And this is essentially allows you to do what amounts to a high quality meta-analysis by just going through reading recovery, or sorry, what was clearinghouse reports and not having to do much research on your own. So I know I have my own website that reviews language programs, but I think if you use Walrus Clearinghouse Evidence for ESSA as a source, you can get a very strong understanding of the research very quickly by using the method that I described in this video. Now, I recently had someone discussing with me if we should try to find a single source for evidence. And actually, I disagree. I think it's important to consider what do multiple sources show. So rather than say just relying on my website or what works Clearinghouse or evidence for ESSA, I would encourage people to look at multiple sources and maybe even consider reading the papers themselves to see if their interpretations match. But I do think this video will provide people with a sort of helpful guide on how better to use these resources. That's it for now, folks, and until next time.